Fernando Alonso has fired a warning shot at the underperforming Aston Martin team. It's time to work harder, to talk less, to deliver more, he said after a pointless Spanish Grand Prix. He's not expecting things to go better in Austria either. He anticipates the Red Bull Ring will be a painful track for Aston Martin because of the long corners and high-speed sections. Fundamental to its problems is a shortfall of fine control of the floor performance under a rule set that yields significant downforce when close to the ground. So why, only 2 months after committing his long-term Formula 1 future to Aston Martin, has Alonso drawn attention to the team's travails so publicly? F1 is all about performance, and he's not happy with the steps being delivered by the team's upgrades. This has been a problem for Aston Martin for some time. Rivals like McLaren, Mercedes and Ferrari have made bigger steps, and too often Aston Martin is slipping behind midfield contenders like RB, Alpine and Williams as its form waxes and wanes with track characteristics. And Spain, where Alonso qualified 11th and finished 12th, was one of its weaker tracks. That's why Alonso is calling on Aston Martin to prove that it can bring new parts to the car that deliver exactly as expected and allow it to close the aerodynamic deficit to the leading teams. The pressure is on, given the vast sums of money Lawrence Stroll, who heads the consortium that owns the team, has invested. It has a new state-of-the-art factory, a cutting-edge wind tunnel that will be completed by the end of the year, a vastly expanded workforce, the Honda partnership in place for 2026, yet it's a long way short of achieving its objectives. These were laid out by Stroll when the team first became Aston Martin Racing in 2021, when he set a timescale of 3 to 5 years for emerging as a genuine frontrunner. However you count the years, time is running out to hit that objective, as this is the 4th season of Aston Martin and the 6th full season since he took control of the ailing Force India team in the summer of 2018. The investment has been spectacular and the recruitment aggressive, but while progress has been made, it's stuttering. That's inevitably led to fears that Stroll's patience is being tested. Team principal Mike Crack, a rational, calm leader who is held in high regard with many who have worked closely with him, shrugged off those concerns recently. He didn't deny Stroll is impatient for success, but stressed that the team owner is realistic about the timescales involved for improving and making parts. Those parts Crack referenced are in the pipeline, and that's something Alonso is positive about. We'll come back to that shortly. But while Aston Martin stresses with some justification that it is still in the building phase and the potential is huge, when measured against the original timeline laid out by its owner, it is not keeping pace. That disconnect is at the heart of the criticism the team gets, no matter how much Crack, who it should be noted didn't lay out the timeline as it was set before he joined at the start of 2022, defends the team's current situation. And it's that, combined with the unconvincing progress relative to the rest of the field, that inevitably raises questions. There's been plenty of talk of Ferrari's Enrico Cardile potentially joining the team, as well as the inevitable courting of Adrian Newey. Both would be impressive appointments, Newey potentially game-changing if deployed correctly. Aston Martin is obviously evasive, but when we asked Crack about the possibility of new arrivals, he talked of the need to be open to the possibility of new recruits. But if Aston Martin is evaluating senior technical appointments, you have to ask what that says about the view on the current leadership. Newey may be the closest thing to a magic bullet in F1 and wouldn't be the day-to-day technical lead at the coalface, but integrating someone like Cardile could be more disruptive. Dan Fallows was recruited from Red Bull at great expense as technical director, and the project initially started well under him, as we'll outline properly in a moment, but the pressure is building given the recent struggles. Alonso's words have added to that. So before we get into what's to come, let's dig into what's happened over the past 18 months. It wasn't long ago that Aston Martin catapulting to near the front of the field was one of the big talking points in F1. Alonso finished on the podium in 6 of the first 8 races in 2023 and was regularly the closest challenger to Red Bull. After 8 races, Aston Martin was 3rd in the Constructors' Championship and would have been 2nd but for Lance Stroll contributing only 37 points to Alonso's 117. Having banked a massive 154 points in the first 8 races, Aston Martin only managed 126 over the remaining 14 events. It fell to 5th in the Constructors' Championship as a result. Now, to be fair to Aston Martin, we have to stress its point scoring early in 2023 was aided by the underachievement of bigger rivals. Ferrari and Mercedes had slow starts to the season, while McLaren struggled badly until a series of upgrades transformed it into a front runner. But Aston Martin floundered at the same time as the competition improved. The car started 2023 very strong in the slow stuff and not so good in the quick bits, but attempts to widen that performance window were not entirely successful. Upgrades made the car harder to drive, at times costing the drivers confidence. The car still worked well at slow tracks, with Alonso taking an outstanding second place at Zandvoort, and late in the season, once Aston Martin had understood some of the problems it introduced and hit on a workable mix and match spec, Alonso took another podium finish with third at Interlagos after that sensational to-the-line battle with Sergio Perez. Encouragingly, Aston Martin's average deficit across the final 3 races was similar to where it was at the start of the season, meaning it looked like the storm had been weathered. The key question was whether the lessons of 2023 had been learned to ensure a repeat of the same problems could be avoided. Aston Martin started this season solidly, dicing with Mercedes to be 4th fastest and picking up top 6 finishes in 3 of the first 4 races. Now, that's not as good as last year, but the pace deficit to the front was similar to the same phase of last season, so that was a solid if unspectacular start. However, the form has since dropped off, and that's what's most concerning. In the first 5 races, Aston Martin was always among the top 4 fastest cars on single-lap pace. Since then, it's bounced between 5th and 9th. While there was a mini revival in Canada where Aston Martin had its biggest haul of the season with 14 points, that was because the Montreal track favoured the car characteristics. The Aston Martin doesn't enjoy long corners, that's partly because it simply doesn't have enough downforce. Now, downforce is easy enough to generate with the powerful Venturi tunnels in the floor. What's more difficult is controlling that and achieving a good balance covering high and low speed corners. That's something Aston Martin has been battling to improve for the past 18 months. There has been a trend of characteristics worsening in unexpected ways when upgrades have been tried. It has made gains. As performance director Tom McCulloch says, the car is a different world to last year's, but everyone is improving. The Aston Martin was almost 9/10 of a second faster in qualifying in Spain than it was last year. The trouble is, others are improving at a faster rate, meaning Aston Martin is going backwards. The consistent problem has been upgrades creating undesirable characteristics. As Alonso says, the car behaved very differently at the start of the season in Bahrain, but started to change when the first significant upgrade was introduced in Japan that featured changes to the floor and side pods. It's this lack of steady, fruitful upgrades that hit the track, can be well understood, and work broadly as anticipated that points to weaknesses in Aston Martin's understanding of the underlying science of these admittedly tricky ground effect cars. Fortunately, there is a reason for hope. Alonso hinted at a breakthrough in understanding that could mean the upgrade that is set to appear for the Hungarian Grand Prix before the summer break is a significant step. He indicates the team is at last more confident in its understanding of its problems and how to tackle them than in previous months. That is a ray of hope. When I asked Crack about Alonso's comments after the Spanish Grand Prix, he said that he shared the optimism on the basis that the results in the wind tunnel and when using other simulation methods are encouraging. Whether all of that optimism will be delivered on with the Hungary update is another question, as there's always a race against time to get parts produced. But McCulloch, a hugely accomplished engineer who knows what he's talking about, says Aston Martin has a clearer idea of what it needs to do now than previously. The trouble is, unlike, say, McLaren, which has been able to clearly articulate its problems and hit publicly stated targets in tackling them, Aston Martin has always been vague on the reasons for its weaknesses and evasive in how they are being addressed, beyond the assurance that they are, even by the standards of a secretive F1 paddock, which makes you wonder whether they are well understood. As one of the most reticent and guarded teams in the paddock, it projects an image of a team that just isn't honest enough with itself in all areas, and given that's a historic strength of the team formerly known as Jordan, that's a concern. Ultimately, performance will tell us whether Aston Martin really does understand and knows how to harness the vastly bolstered power of its team. And given Alonso is piling on the public pressure while claiming to be confident, it's hard to imagine he won't make his displeasure clear if once again upgrades don't deliver what they should. The team has realised that the original timeline was optimistic and stresses that it is still in a building phase as its new campus is far from complete and 2026 is the logical focal point given the arrival of Honda, and the clean sheet of paper rules-wise presents a big opportunity. But as Crack says, any set timeline has to be treated with caution because progress is not always linear. But what is concerning is that this team is in roughly the same place in terms of competitiveness as it was in the closing stages of 2022, when it was generally the 6th best team. It doesn't have to be winning right now, but the imminent upgrades need to re-establish it as a consistent Q3 regular and start the process of inching towards the top 4 teams. If this pattern of disappointing upgrades continues and the performance relative to the opposition does not improve as a result, it's easy to imagine a scenario where Lawrence Stroll questions even more forcefully the stagnation and seeks to take corrective action.